You probably hear about the G7 in the news, maybe leaders meeting somewhere scenic, making these big pronouncements. But have you ever really stopped to think about what the G7 actually is? I mean, how did it even start? And maybe more importantly, how much power does it really have today?
That's a really great question because it's definitely more than just a photo op. Essentially, it's an intergovernmental political and economic forum. You've got Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US.
The big players.
Exactly. And interestingly, the European Union also has this special status. They call it a non-enumerated member. It's represented by the Commission President and the European Council President.
Okay, so it's like a club of some of the world's most advanced economies, right? And they're organized around these shared values, pluralism, liberal democracy, representative government, that sort of thing.
That's the idea. And their mission, broadly, is to discuss and coordinate solutions to major global issues. Think trade, security, economics, and increasingly climate change.
Right. So today, we're doing one of our deep dives into the G7. We've got this extensive source material, and our mission, really, is to pull out the most important bits of knowledge and insight for you. We're going to, unpack its kind of surprising origins, trace how it's evolved, look at its influence now, and get into some of the debates and criticisms swirling around it. Is it still relevant?
Exactly.
Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly clued up on this influential group. We'll find some surprising facts, maybe a little humor along the way. Okay, let's unpack this. So maybe first, let's just nail down who's actually in the room. You listed them: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, US.
This isn't.
And the EU with that unique, non-enumerated role. You've got the Commission President, European Council President. But how does a group like this, with so much apparent clout, actually work without, like, a formal treaty or headquarters?
Yeah, it's a fascinating setup, really. It's not based on any treaty. There's no permanent secretariat, no central office building somewhere. No. Instead, it operates through this annually rotating presidency. So, whichever country is holding the presidency candidates up for 2025, they get to set the priorities for the year and host the big summit. It's remarkably informal for such a heavyweight group.
Which makes its influence even more striking, doesn't it? I mean, despite lacking that formal legal basis, the G7 has managed to spearhead some really major global initiatives.
Absolutely. Things like the efforts to combat the HIV/AIDS pandemic, huge financial aid packages for developing countries, and even playing a key role in things like the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change.
So it shows that collective can still pack a punch, even informally.
It really can. And, when you look at the economic side, their influence becomes crystal clear. The G7 countries together, they hold around 50% of the entire world's nominal net wealth. That's huge.
50%. Wow. And what about GDP?
Well, as of 2024, they account for over 44% of the world's nominal GDP. And if you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, it's about 30%.
Okay, just quickly, purchasing power parity, that's where they adjust for, like, the cost of living differences, right? So you can compare economies more accurately than just raw GDP.
Precisely. It gives a better sense of the actual economic output. So yeah, these aren't just abstract numbers. They represent real, serious economic muscle.
And population-wise?
Their combined population is about 780 million people, so almost 10% of the world's population. But really, it's that economic weight combined with those shared values that often lets them, set the agenda on critical global issues.
Which is a perfect lead-in to its origins because they're kind of amazing. This global powerhouse started really small, almost secretly. Picture this. 1973, the U.S. Treasury Secretary George Shultz, he convenes this informal ad hoc meeting. Finance ministers from West Germany, France, the UK. And where did they meet? Not some grand conference center, the White House library.
Just in the library. That was the library group. Very low-key beginnings.
Super low-key. And that little group expanded pretty fast, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Later in '73, Japan was invited to join. So then it became known as the Group of Five. Still very much a quiet gathering of the top economic guys trying to figure out what was happening globally.
Okay, but then things get really wild. 1974, what a year.
Oh, absolutely chaotic.
You had the French president, Pompidou, die in office. Then scandals took down West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, U.S. President Nixon, and Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka all resigned.
Unbelievable turnover. And the UK was facing its own government instability, too.
Right, so you've got this massive leadership churn across the major Western economy.
Exactly. And into this vacuum steps Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford. He had this idea, quite simple really. Let's just have a retreat for these new leaders. Let them get to know each other away from the press.
A sort of G-leader mixer.
Pretty much. And that simple idea really paved the way for something much bigger.
Because the French president, Giscard d'Estaing, and the German chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, they ran with it, right?
They did. Yeah. In November 1975, France hosted this 3-day summit. Beautiful setting, the Château de Rambouillet. They invited the Group of 5 plus Italy, and boom, you have the Group of 6, the G6.
And what was on the agenda for that first official summit?
Oh, the big economic crises of the time. The oil crisis was raging, the Bretton Woods system, the whole post-war fixed exchange rate system based on the dollar and gold had just collapsed. Global recession, big stuff.
So, heavy topics. What came out of it?
They produced this 15-point Declaration of Rambouillet. It committed them to things like free trade, multilateralism, cooperating with developing countries, even trying to improve relations with the Eastern Bloc. Crucially, they also agreed to meet annually. That really cemented it as a forum.
So the G6 is born out of crisis and a desire for coordination, but we're still one member short of the G7. How did Canada get its seat at the table?
I was pretty quick, actually. In 1976, Schmidt and Ford pushed to invite Pierre Trudeau. He was the Canadian Prime Minister, had been in office for 8 years already, so he brought a lot of experience.
And Canada was the next biggest economy.
Exactly. Next largest advanced economy after the G6 members. So the summit later that year, held in Dorado, Puerto Rico, that became the very first meeting of the current Group of 7, the G7 we know today.
And then the group expanded again in a way with the EU.
That's right. In 1977, the UK was hosting and invited the European Economic Community, as it was then known. Since 1981, the EU, through the Commission President and the leader of the country holding the Council presidency, has been at every single gathering. And since 2009, the European Council President comes along too. So the EU has this really embedded, unique role.
It's funny to think that for quite a while, these meetings weren't even public knowledge.
Yeah, it wasn't until 1985, with the Plaza Accord, that big agreement to weaken the U.S. dollar, that the finance ministers' meetings and their joint statements, the communiques, really became public.
And the 80s also saw them broaden their focus beyond just economics, right?
Definitely. They started wading into international security, conflicts like the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Their remit was expanding.
Which eventually leads us to the G8 era. Russia joining the club. How did that happen?
It was gradual. After the '94 summit in Naples, Russian officials started having separate meetings alongside the main G7 ones, kind of an informal political 8, or P8.
Okay.
Then, in 1998, Russian President Boris Yeltsin was invited as a full participant. And there you had it, the Group of 8, the G8.
But Russia was always a bit different from the others in that group, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A real outlier. I mean, economically, it just wasn't in the same league in terms of national wealth or financial weight. And, at the time, it wasn't really seen as a fully established liberal democracy like the others.
So why invite them?
It was largely strategic. The thinking was bring Russia in, encourage its political and economic reforms, get it more engaged internationally after the Cold War. It was, a bit of a gamble for global stability.
A gamble that didn't entirely pay off because that G8 era ended pretty abruptly.
It did. March 2014, Russia's membership was suspended. Straight-up response to its annexation of Crimea.
The G7 called it a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Exactly. And the G8 summit planned for Sochi in Russia was immediately canceled and moved to Brussels, becoming a G7 meeting again.
And Russia eventually made the split permanent.
Yes. In 2017, Russia announced it was leaving the G8 arrangement for good. There have been calls to bring them back. President Trump in 2020, supported by Italy's PM Conte, argued for it.
But the others weren't having it.
No. Rejected outright by all the other members, showed just how deep that rift had become.
So beyond Russia, there's been this constant background noise, these calls to expand the G7 further. Who else might join?
Yeah, that debate keeps bubbling up. Various proposals are out there. You've got think tanks like the Atlantic Council pushing this D10 idea, basically G7 plus Australia and South Korea, maybe with India and others as observers, a sort of democracy 10.
Interesting. Any other ideas?
Well, ironically, Russia itself, under Putin back in 2019, suggested maybe China, India, and Turkey could join, if Russia got back in, of course. President Trump, in 2020, also floated adding Australia, Brazil, India, and South Korea, alongside bringing Russia back, which, as we said, was a non-starter for others.
And we've seen more guest invitations recently, haven't we? That seems to be the main way they're broadening the conversation.
Exactly that. Boris Johnson invited Australia and South Korea, plus India, to the 2021 summit. Germany invited India again in 2022. Japan's summit in Hiroshima in 2023 had a huge guest list. South Korea, Australia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Vietnam, the Comoros, Cook Islands, Ukraine.
Wow, quite a crowd.
It really shows they're trying to engage more widely. The Carnegie Endowment even formally proposed a G9, permanently adding South Korea and Australia to tackle what they call the group's Eurocentrism and the China challenge.
And Canada's continuing that trend for 2025.
Yep. For the Kananaskis Summit, Prime Minister Mark Carney's invited Ukraine's President Zelensky, Australia's PM Albanese, India's Modi, Mexico's President Sheinbaum, and South Korea's President Lee. So while permanent membership isn't changing, the guest list is definitely expanding the dialogue.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about what the G7 actually does. Its activities. It started with economic coordination, right? Responding to things like the Nixon shock in '71.
Right, when the U.S. broke the dollar's link to gold.
And the '70s energy crisis. And the finance ministers still meet regularly.
At least twice a year, yeah. That core economic coordination role continues. But their impact has gone way beyond just macroeconomics.
Like what else?
Well, debt relief, for instance. They launched a big program back in the 90s for heavily indebted poor countries, HIPC. It ended up providing something like $100 billion in relief, later expanded to potentially 100% debt cancellation for some.
That's significant.
Huge. They also put up $300 million to help build that giant shelter structure over the damaged reactor at Chernobyl, and they established the Financial Stability Forum to help, keep the global financial system stable.
They also helped launch the G20, didn't they?
They did, back in 1999. The idea was to create dialogue between the big industrial countries and major emerging markets. Some people even thought the G20 might eventually replace the G7.
And how did they handle the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, the G7 finance ministers pledged to take all necessary steps. They came up with this aggressive action plan, which included things like governments putting capital directly into banks. Although some critics said they focused too much on individual country responses rather than a truly united global plan.
Okay. And geopolitically, especially regarding Russia and Ukraine?
They've been very consistent, very strong in their stance against what they call Russia's destabilizing behavior and malign activities. Condemning the Crimea annexation in 2014, providing technical help to Ukraine, imposing rounds of sanctions.
Right.
The 2021 summit specifically called on Russia to tackle cybercrime originating from its territory and investigate the chemical weapon attack on Alexei Navalny. And after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, G7 leaders were quickly invited to an extraordinary NATO summit. Shows how central they are in coordinating Western responses.
And now they're deep into global health and climate change, too.
Absolutely. The 2021 summit focused heavily on recovering from COVID-19 global vaccination efforts. And they're pushing hard on climate action and biodiversity loss. Just this past April 2024, they agreed to phase out their coal power plants by 2030-2035 unless they have carbon capture or meet that 1.5-degree warming limit.
Though sometimes their actions seem, well, a bit small compared to the problem, like the Amazon fires in 2019.
Yes, the U.S. $20 million pledge, widely seen as a relatively small amount given the scale of the fires.
And didn't Macron threaten to block a trade deal with Brazil over it?
He did, threatened to block the EU-Mercosur trade deal because of deforestation concerns. But that threat actually got pushback from Germany and the UK within the G7 itself.
Huh. So not always singing from the same hymn sheet then. Sounds less like a coordinated summit and more like a tense family dinner sometimes.
Well, you've hit on a really key point there. That internal friction. It's definitely a recurring issue. The heads of government have their big annual summit, usually June or July. But throughout the year, there are tons of other meetings, finance ministers, environment, health, trade, foreign ministers.
Well, they talk a lot.
Constantly. It's supposed to build cooperation. But yeah, sometimes it just throws the disagreements into sharp relief.
Which does raise that big question. How effective can the G7 really be when there's that kind of friction, especially when it becomes public? The 2018 summit in Canada comes to mind. Charlevoix.
Oh, that was a classic example. Really fractious negotiations, mostly over tariffs. Remember, the Trump administration had just slapped steel and aluminum tariffs on allies, including Canada, the host.
Right. And Trump publicly criticized Trudeau and told his team not to sign the joint economic statement.
Exactly. Pulled his endorsement via Twitter after leaving. Angela Merkel famously called it a depressing withdrawal. Macron told him to be serious. It was not a picture of unity.
No kidding. And that internal stuff is just one layer of criticism, right?
For sure. Broader criticisms often focus on the G7 being, allegedly outdated, having limited membership, not representing the whole globe effectively. People point to the rise of groups like BRICS, plus Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now with new members too.
Suggesting a shift in global power.
Precisely. That the G7 maybe doesn't reflect today's multipolar world anymore. The fundamental tension is, how does this club of established like-minded democracies stay relevant and effective when so much economic and political power is shifting elsewhere, often to countries that don't share those values?
And the public definitely voices that skepticism sometimes. Those protests in Germany in 2015.
Yeah, around 7,500 protesters in Bavaria, questioning the G7's legitimacy to make decisions for the whole world. The authorities deployed 20,000 police, built a 7-kilometer security fence. Huge security operation.
Shows attention. And even other major powers are pushing back, like China recently.
Just this March, 2025, China criticized a G7 statement that raised concerns about its nuclear program, its actions in the South China Sea, its market policies, basically questioning the G7's right to comment on those things.
So quite a journey we've traced. From that quiet library group in a White House room to this very high-profile, sometimes controversial global forum navigating really complex times. This deep dive, I think, shows how the G7 has constantly had to evolve from pure economics to security, health, climate, always trying to adapt.
Absolutely. It's been a process of constant adaptation, trying to stay relevant.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean for you listening? Well, the G7, this forum of some of the world's wealthiest advanced economies, it clearly still holds significant sway. It shapes global responses to crises, coordinates big international initiatives.
No doubt about that.
But at the same time, it faces these really persistent questions. Is it representative enough? Is it truly effective in a world with rising powers like China and India? Can it overcome its own internal disagreements? It's this group that's always adapting, inviting more guests, trying to stay central, but constantly walking this tightrope between its core values and the messy realities of global politics.
And that leads to a final thought, maybe something for you to mull over. Considering the rise of these other forums, like the G20, like BRICS plus stage, and all this talk about expanding the G7 itself, how do you think the G7 can actually maintain its unique influence in the years ahead, especially with massive challenges like climate change or untangling global supply chains? What do you see as the biggest challenge or maybe the biggest opportunity for a group like the G7 moving forward?